over here. So we covered, some applications, some work that is happening in our lab at IIT Mandi, especially in the area of AI applications for MRI images, and we covered different sub modalities of MRI, and different cases of improving the resolution, segmentation, and some classification towards the end. Okay. Yeah. So that was the basic idea of yesterday's talk. Now today's talk we will be moving to what is known as electroencephalography or EEG. Okay, so I think some of you may know what EEG is, but I'll give you a brief primer on EEG to start with. So it is not about images. This is about signals. Okay, so again, but the theme is similar. We will consider different types of models, right, of say in deep learning or deep learning networks, and look at some applications where these models can be useful for making various kinds of tasks, or various kinds of decision making tasks or reconstruction tasks with respect to EEG. So let me just quickly share my screen. Okay, so I think you are able to see my screen now. Can someone confirm if the screen is visible? Hello?
Yes, sir, it is visible.
Yeah, okay. Thank you. Okay, so we move on to the second part of this broad talk on applications in healthcare and biosignal analysis. So yesterday was, like I said, focused mostly on applications in MRI, and today we'll be focusing on applications in EEG. Okay. So EEG, or is a short form of electroencephalography. Right? Basically, I think many of you may have seen these pictures. Either in technical works, or maybe some popular articles, or even science fiction movies. So basically the idea here is that we are recording some signals from the brain, but unlike EEG, sorry, unlike fMRI or MRI, the system is a very compact system. Right? It is basically a cap with a bunch of electrodes, which is basically fit on your head, right? And these cap has holes wherein these electrodes are placed, and these electrodes try to sense the the what are popularly known as brain waves, but we will give a technical meaning to it, through your head. Right. So now, what are these so-called brain waves that people talk about? Right? So see, there is continuous electrical activity going on in the brain thanks to the neurochemical exchanges between neurons, right? But see, recording at the level of neurons is very, very hard. I mean, it can be done in a lab, in the sense that we can sort of extract some neurons from say animals, right? Say there are experiments which are done on mice and so on. So we can extract certain single neurons, or a very small set of neurons, and then stimulate it under a microscope, using some electrical signal, and see the responses. Right? But so those experiments are basically called in vitro experiments, where we are trying to understand how a particular neuron, or a small group of neurons behave. Right? However, when it comes to human experiments, we cannot really do this. And also, the purpose of doing human experiments is to understand more higher level tasks, right? So for example, how attentive I am, like if I'm making a certain decision, why I'm making a certain decision, what is happening in my brain when I'm say under an influence of alcohol, for example, right? Or what is happening in my brain when I'm say binging too much, or sleeping very little, right? So these things need not actually be studied at the level of single neurons. These things are typically studied at the level of broad regions of brain. So yesterday, for example, towards the end, right, we saw this example of brain connectivity. Okay, that different areas in brains are connected in different ways, right? So that was basically what was called a structural connectivity. Those were like physical pathways, right? So different areas are connected in very complex physical pathways, right? What we are interested here is not physical pathways but functional pathways and also functional properties of each region, right? That if I am doing a particular task, which regions of my brain are becoming more active, right? For example, if I'm doing a visual task, then the back of my head, like the brain region which is typically situated at the back of my head, which is called a visual cortex, that will be more active, right? If I'm doing an auditory task, a hearing task, then auditory cortex, which is typically at the side of my head, right, both sides of my head, that will become more active, right? If I'm making a decision making task which involves more complex problem solving and so on, then there will be higher activity in the frontal region of the brain, right? So because the frontal region is dealing with evolutionary, humans have a more developed frontal regions because that deals with higher order cognitive processes and so on. So we are interested in gross level activity, right? Because that is enough for us to make decisions about how each region is performing under what kind of activity, right? Similarly, under some diseases, like for example, epilepsy, right? Or some perception disorders, like say auditory disorders, where the problem is not in the ear, but the problem may be inside the brain, right? Maybe due to a trauma or head injury, people may lose speech, right? In stroke, people typically tend to lose speech production, or they become paralyzed, right? So basically, they so we, sometimes people suffer from perception disorders which are not due to the the organ itself, the problem with the organ itself, but due to the messaging that the or the signaling that the brain gives to a particular organ, right? Or the brain takes from a particular organ, right? So to understand these at a gross level, these things can be understood at a gross level before you decide to do a surgery or any treatment and so on, any therapy and so on. Even during say rehabilitation, say for example, if a stroke patient is undergoing rehabilitation for paralysis, so gradually his motor movements are he's recovering and his motor movements are getting re-established. The progress that we can measure in this can be assessed using EEG, right? That I may not be able to move my hand, but I may be able to generate, due to that physiotherapy, due to certain rehabilitation techniques, it is quite possible that the neurons in my brain are getting generated, and eventually enough connections will be established so that my functions will be re-established, right? So the progress can be measured directly by observation, but if it cannot be measured directly by observation, sometimes it is also useful to measure progress by measuring the signaling in the brain, because that is a very strong indication about such changes in the brain, whether there is progress during rehabilitation or not, right? So there are many applications, right? Now what we are exactly recording is not, like I said, is not a signal at the level of signal neurons, right? We are recording signal, so each of that electrode is effectively trying to record an average signal which is due to the potential differences, right? This electrical activity causes potential differences, right, at each neuron. But what an electrode is recording, for example, an electrode is here, it will try to send signal in a fairly large area, right? Inside the brain, right? And that area may consist of like tens of thousands of neurons, right? So even an area of say a few centimeters square, right? That will typically take signaling from say tens of thousands of neurons, if not more, right? I mean, it can even be like lakhs of neurons, right? So, but the purpose here is not to sense, signal at very, very micro, scale, but, but it is enough for many applications to sense the signals at a regional level, because yesterday, as we saw, that different regions are connected in different ways, right? So, and if there is a very nice localization in the brain, which is a regional localization, that that a certain type of neurons in a particular region will behave will behave in a similar manner towards satisfying a particular functionality, right? Which is why these kind of techniques are actually successful, right? So nature has given us this nice localization, this functional localization, that this region is meant for this functionality, this region is meant for this functionality, and so on. Which is why it is helpful to use such techniques, right? If we did not have this localization, if any function was localized anywhere, right, or it was distributed, then it would have been impossible to actually devise such techniques. Right? So that is the background of EEG, and of course there can be both clinical and non-clinical applications. Like I said, clinical applications involve epilepsy or certain sensing certain disorders, which are originating from the brain, and the issue is with the signaling in the brain to the organ. There are some cognitive applications which are typically done on healthy persons, right? For example, if you want to understand how say how a bunch of school kids, right, which are undergoing different types of training, how is their intellectual capability getting evolved, or how is their creative abilities getting evolved, right? For example, if I want to understand that whether excessive use of LLMs, right, is harming the creative potential, right? So if I keep using GPTs to write my essays and write my papers and so on, right, will I lose creativity, right? Now that those kind of things are what are known as cognitive experiments, right? And EEGs can also be used for understanding cognitive abilities such as attention, decision making, creativity, and so on. And of course, these can lead to some BCI applications. BCI means brain computer interface applications, right? Like for example, controlling a wheelchair, right? Or controlling, say, if a patient is partially paralyzed, can he control, with his thoughts, the the cursor on a mouse, or can he dial a phone number, things like that, right? So these things are no more science fiction. These are actually happening in labs, and hopefully they will be available soon in commercial setups as well, right? So this is the overall background of EEG. Any questions at this point? Okay. Right. So now what we are doing in the lab, we are working with EEG since last about 5 to 6 years. We have a few graduate students, PhD students graduated, and some are ongoing on these kinds of problems. Right? So one of the very interesting problems. So what I'll do is I'll cover two problems in more detail, and then I will kind of cover one slide for each of the other two problems. Okay? Yeah. So, so one of the problems that we were kind of interested in is what is known as a perceptual brain decoding problem. About 5 years back, there were like hardly 4 or 5 papers in this area. Now, of course, there are a few more, but it's still, it's still a fairly niche, problem. It's a very interesting problem. There are a few data sets now for this problem, and we are also collecting our own data set, which will be hopefully be available by early next year. We'll make it publicly available. The task is this, that I mean, or let me sort of motivate a more sort of a dreamy task, right? So suppose you're imagining something. Can I can I understand, or can a machine understand, or can an AI system understand what you are imagining, or can an AI system read your thoughts, right? Now this is of course a far-fetched idea, but whenever there is a new idea, right? If I want to say work on a new idea, what we typically do is we work on a simpler version of that particular idea, right? Now here the simpler version is as follows, that for example in this case, see, this is how a typical EEG is recorded. This is a task based EEG. There are EEGs for sleep studies as well, where the person is wearing a cap while he's sleeping, right? So that is a different area, that is a very wide area called sleep research, where also EEG is actually used, sleep quality analysis and so on, right? But this is for any particular task, right? So a person looks at a screen, something is happening on the screen, and the person needs to either respond or keep looking at the screen, right? Now in this case, the idea is that the person doesn't have to respond, he just has to keep looking at the screen. what is happening at the screen is we are showing different images of different animals, objects, scenes, etc., etc. Right? These are different images, right? And of course, we have a set of images, or say a class of, say, a bunch of, say, 40 classes of images. Right? So it could be tiger, house, mobile phone, trees, etc., etc. Right? So we have, say, 40 classes of images. These are all natural, images mostly, like standard camera images. Now, the person doesn't have to do anything, doesn't have to move any fingers, or he just has to keep looking. All he has to do is he has to pay attention to each image, basically. Right? He doesn't have to doze off. That's the constraint. If a person gets tired, then he has to say that, okay, I'm no more interested. Right? As long as he's attentive, right? So the experiments last for, say, about 20 minutes to half an hour, the data collection. So in that, I think it's easy to maintain your attention. So when a person records an image, we say that when a person sees an image, we record the corresponding EEG. Okay? And when the image changes, we know when the image is changing. So we say that, okay, this part of the EEG corresponds to say one image, this part of the image corresponds to image 2, this part of the EEG corresponds to image 3, and so, right? So the data set is that you are showing, say, 50 images of, say, a tree, 50 images of a tiger, 50 images of a house, 50 images of, a mobile phone, a bag, a flower, etc., etc. And you're collecting, data for these, say, suppose you have 40 classes of images, then you have 2000 different EEG signals for each subject, right? So 50 into 40, right? So you have so many EEG signals for each, subjects. That is the idea. Right? Now, why I say this is a simpler version of this fantastic problem that I mentioned earlier, that here I exactly know what the person is seeing, right? So I am not, I'm not asking the person to imagine some arbitrary thing. See, because even if I ask a person to imagine a tree, I don't know what kind of tree the person is imagining. Right? So basically, right? So that is the thing. But here, or maybe he's imagining something else other than the tree. Right? Now here, it is assumed that if the person is attentive, right, he's not imagining some arbitrary things. Of course, there may be a slight mind wandering. That is okay. That is a reason where there is noise in the data. But if there is something which is in front of you on the screen, typically your mind wandering will be less, right? So you will not, your mind will not wander, right? So it is a fair assumption to see that visual data is a very strong stimulus for our brain, right? We are least our attention is highest when we are exposed to visual data as compared to other data. Yeah. So it is fair to assume that in most of the cases, in most of these 2000 EEG signals, at least majority of the cases, that we know exactly what the person, what kind of stimulus the person is getting inside the head, and uh, at some level, at least in some regions, the EEG signals which are corresponding to, say, a tiger image or a tree image, or or a mobile phone image or whatever, right? The hypothesis is that these EEG signals will have some small differences, right? So some tiny differences, which of course they will not be obvious. If I just look at the EEG signals, I will not be able to say, okay, this corresponds to tiger, this corresponds to tree, right? Because EEG signals typically look like this. They're very, very kind of noisy, signals, right? Typically look like this. Okay. But this is a set of EEG signals, which is, say, one from each channel. Okay? So these electrodes are called channels. Okay? Right. Now, given all this data, right, an easier task that I want to solve is that, given this hypothesis that an EEG of a tree versus an EEG of a tiger versus an EEG of a pencil versus an EEG of a house, right, you know, will have some differences among themselves. Right? Now, if they indeed have some differences among themselves, can I magnify those differences, right, through, say, a deep learning network? And can I do EEG classification first, right? Saying that, okay, this signals belong to a tree, this signals belong to a house, this signals belong to when the person was seeing a tiger image, this signals belong to when a person was seeing a pencil image, etc., and so on, right? So the first task is classification, right? Because this itself is a not very obvious problem, right? Because see, in the visual cortex, whenever I'm seeing an image or whenever I'm thinking about an image, right, it's not just the visual cortex that is activated. Of course, there are different regions of the brain that are also activated, and all of these signals are noisy. So just by looking at the signals, I cannot establish this difference. Right? So that is my first question: that whether this hypothesis is correct or not. Right? Can I develop an algorithm which can differentiate an EEG between watching a tiger image, between watching a tree image, and so on. Right? So among this, and it's not just one or two classes; it is for like a huge number of classes, which is say 40 classes. Okay? That's one question. And the second question is that yesterday, since we looked at these generative models, right? For example, we looked at models which were able to generate images, right? So the enhancement that we saw yesterday was basically about generating certain images. Okay. Right. Yesterday, of course, the idea was that we were trying to generate an image which was kind of a transformed version of an input image. Right? But in general, when you look at these the modern Gen AI models, you can generate beautiful images, right? You can generate faces, you can generate nice scenes, right? Very nice. I mean, these days it's all over social media, right? So I think everyone of you knows what is the power of image generation using generative models, right? Now here is the challenge, right? Given that we have such nice generative models which can generate amazing data, right? But all of these are currently text based, right? So you give a text prompt and it will generate something, right? You give a input as the text. So I want to generate an image of say a dog flying in an airplane, for example, right? So I can give some arbitrary text prompt and it will generate some very fantastic images. Right? So all of these models are based on text. Right? Can I develop a model which takes in the input of this EEG, which is corresponding to a particular image, and train that model so as to, so that when I give a particular EEG, which is corresponding to a particular type of image, can it generate that type of image, right? For example, if I give an EEG which is corresponding to a tiger image, can your model generate a tiger image, right? It may not be that specific tiger, but it may be a tiger, right? That is of course the an easier version of the problem, right? I may not generate exactly that tree because see, generation is essentially sampling from a distribution, right? I have a bunch of images, I have a distribution of tree images. I'm basically sampling from that high dimensional distribution, right? So the easier problem is that I may not be able to generate exactly that particular image, but I should be able to at least generate an image which is of a tiger if I give an EEG corresponding to a tiger, right? Now see, both these problems are actually related, right? See, in the first problem, what we are saying is that there is a mapping between, the hypothesis is that there is a mapping between the EEG and the class label, right? So that if there is a mapping between an image and the class label, right, there will be a mapping, there has to be a mapping between an EEG and the class label, right? That is what we are saying in the classification problem, that an EEG of a tiger class will look different than an EEG of a tree class, right? Which will look different than an EEG of a pencil class, right? I don't know how that difference is, but that is what my network should learn, right? So there is a mapping between an EEG and a corresponding type of image. Now, given that such a mapping exists, right, I can condition the generative model, right, that if there is a mapping between a particular EEG and a particular type of class, then I should be able to condition my generative model or constrain my generative model to generate only those type of images, right? If I give that corresponding EEG, right? So both these problems are actually related. The first problem is to establish this hypothesis, and if this hypothesis is true and my classification results are high, right? So that means this hypothesis is at least sensible, right? May not be super accurate, but it is at least sensible. Right? Because if I'm getting say an 80% result on a 40 class problem, That means there is at least some mapping, right? It is not a random coin toss, right? So if I'm getting a reasonably good classification, that means such a mapping exists. Now I can exploit that mapping for generating those class of images. That is the basic, idea. Okay, so this is the whole notion of, perceptual brain decoding framework, right? So in this case, we're talking about visual brain decoding. So I'm even boiling it down. Perceptual means, of course, there are similar works on, audio and so on, but here we are talking of visual, data. Okay, so this is what I want to first solve, right? So this is what we started working with, that we develop a simple classifier, right? This is a simple one, a convolution-based classifier, right? So yesterday we saw that convolution network. So of course you can refer to these papers, for more details. You can take a picture if you want, right? But basically we started with a simple convolution-based classifier, and like I said, right, we're getting reasonably good rates, say about 75% over a class of over a set of 40 classes, right? Which is definitely much better than a coin toss, right? This is, see, these may not be 90%, 95%, but this is at least, these are at least like they indicate that, that a mapping exists between a EEG and a particular type of, object images. Right? So this was the network, right? See, yesterday when we're looking at images, all those convolution networks and those autoencoders were two-dimensional, right? But because now EEG is one-dimensional signal, we have two dimension in the sense that we have multiple channels and each channel is a time series basically, right? But as such, it should be treated as a 1D signal and it should be treated as a set of 1D signals, right? So that's how we are treating this, because the resolution is not the same in the time domain and in the channel domain, right? So on the x-axis we have, say, time series, and on the y-axis we have different channels, right? That's how an EEG is, so basically this, right? So we have this data. So one should not interpret this data as a two-dimensional data, because this resolution is very different from this resolution, right? This will have, say, 200 samples per second. This will have only, say, 32 channels, right? So, this will have far a much greater dimension and much greater resolution as compared to, this. So we'll treat this as, as one dimensional, a set of one dimensional data, and hence we've designed a 1D convolution network, which will basically, treat both these axes separately, right? So there is 1D convolution happening on the time axis, and there is another 1D convolution which is happening on the channel axis, right? And so on, right? So we can make this is a shallow network, but you can of course play around with the hyperparameters and make it. But the basic idea here is that the convolution is not a 2D convolution anymore, right? That is typically used in a image classification problem, but it is a 1D convolution. Now, because there are two directions, one is the time direction, one is the spatial direction, we apply separate convolution filters because there are different characteristics of these different dimensions. Right? So we apply separate convolution filters on these two dimensions. Right? So that is the basic idea. Right? But otherwise this is a standard convolution network. Right? So except for this idea of processing things in a one-dimensional form, the rest of the structure is similar to the convolution network that we saw. So the filters that we learn here, the concept of filters that we learned yesterday, the filters that we learn here are basically 1D filters. Right? Yesterday we saw 2D filters. Here we will have 1D filters. Right. So this was our earlier work, which was kind of pouring around here. Okay. Now, because the EEG data is highly noisy data, it's not like an image data where you can see things very clearly and so on, right? So in general, EEG classification is a hard problem. Okay, in general, EEG classification is basically a hard problem. So we need more constraints to solve this problem. Okay, so one such constraint. So this is also relatively old work, but one such constraint comes from what is known as a triplet loss, right? So see, in this case, the loss that we use to train this network is a simple, cross entropy loss, which is simple, as we said yesterday, right? That if my class label is correct, the loss is 0. If my class label is incorrect, there will be some penalty, right? So this is a simple, binary loss. It is, it's basically based on a concept of entropy, right? Which is defined through probabilities of the class labels, right? But it's basically a binary loss, right? However, as I said, right, it's because EEG is a highly noisy data, right? We can come up with better ways of constraining the problems. So one such way is that we use what is known as a Siamese network, which involves basically this triplet loss. The idea is that instead of one CNN, we are using three parallel CNNs, and say that there is a concept of an anchor sample, a positive sample, and a negative sample. Suppose I have a tree image, right, or an EEG corresponding to a tree image. Right? I take from my training data another EEG which is also corresponding to a tree image and call that as a positive sample. Then I take from my training data another EEG which is corresponding to some other image, right? So it will not be a tree image, it will maybe be some house image. Right? I call that a negative sample. Like this, I will make different pairs of positive and negative samples for all classes. So I'll have a huge number of triplets. Okay. So there will be the anchor, which is like a reference, sample. There will be the positive sample, which is basically the same label as the reference sample, and there's a negative sample. Now the goal is simple. Now you have to train this network parallelly, so all these weights will be updated simultaneously. So it's basically just the same network, except that it is, there are three versions of it, and they are all updated in an exactly same manner. Okay. So the way this loss functions is that, you see, because you know that anchor and positive belong to the same class, right? You are trying to minimize this loss, right? Because this whole thing is minimized, right? This whole thing is minimized. So this has a positive sign. So anchor and positive should be the difference between the anchor and positive, because they belong to the same class. That difference should be lesser and lesser, and the difference between anchor and negative, that difference should be higher, right? That's why there is a negative sign here, because this whole thing is minimized. So this will be minimized only when this is minimized and this is maximized, right? And this is basically just the buffer between these two, that this. So this guy should be away from this guy by at least a margin of alpha, right? That is the buffer, right? But the important thing is that you are minimizing the difference between the samples of the same class. You are maximizing the difference between the samples of the other class, and hence this overall loss is defined in such a way, right? So this is called as a triplet loss. Also there are many modern variants of this. One such variant is called a contrastive loss, right? But the idea is similar in both these kinds of losses, right? So contrastive loss is also something similar, where you are minimizing the difference of similar data and you are maximizing the difference of dissimilar data, right? That is the basic idea. Okay? So this will ensure more constraint, because if my data is noisy, my distribution of the data is very spread out very widely. So the idea here is that if I'm learning different features, the distribution of the original data may be very wide, but the distribution of my feature, which is finally going to the classifier, will be more compact, if I use this kind of loss, right? So if it is better, if it is more compact, then my results will be, better. Right? So this is the basic, idea. Okay. Right. So next we will go to, so these are the two frameworks till now. So what we are covering is different frameworks of classification first, right? So this was a simple baseline framework. Now the same framework we are optimizing it using a triplet loss, right? So which causes certain improvements in the results. Right? Okay. Now the next framework is what is known as is a domain adaptation framework or a domain generalization framework. Right? So one problem with EEG is that, see, when we collect data from different subjects, and these are human subjects, right? So there will be significant variations in the human subjects. Right? when it comes to, such kinds of cognitive tasks, right? Because like I said, right, that, okay, we are assuming that, okay, there is constant attention, but of course, see, if you are sitting for 20 minutes, 30 minutes, there will be some mind wandering, right? Maybe, and maybe there will be, some subjects will move their fingers, nobody can sit still, right? Some may move their back a little bit and so on, right? So all of this will add to artifacts in the EEG data, which we have absolutely no control of, right? So in general, whenever you collect human data, you have to assume that there is, subject dependent variation, which is completely out of our control. And this is not just sensor noise. Okay, these are like gross artifacts which are, caused by subjects basically. Okay. So now the question is that in your data, while we have established that there is differentiation in the EEG with respect to the classes, as these results, sort of convey, that there is definite differentiation in EEG with respect to the classes. What this is what we want, right, in terms of the object classes. Right? But there is also differences in the EEG in terms of the subjects, right? That, EEG is different because of the subject variations as well, right? So that subject variation has nothing to do with my original problem, right? Because my original problem, I'm trying to learn the differences in the EEG, which is due to the main the main criteria that I want to solve. The differences should be with respect to the object classes. Right? But now, because of this subject variability, there will obviously be differences in the EEG due to, subjects. Okay, now how do I, how do I basically, address this? Right? So here what we have is we have what are known as domain generalization network. Right? So one such network is what is known as a gradient reversal layer. Right? What domain generalization means is that if my data is coming from different sources, right, then, I want to minimize the variation in the data with respect to, those sources, because that is not my primary, goal for differentiation. Okay. You know, I want to minimize the variations in my data because of those sources, because I want to maximize the variations in my data, based on the kind of, classification problem that I'm trying to solve in the first place, right? In this case, the sources are different subjects, but the primary classification problem is different objects, right? Different images, different classes of images, right? So I want to minimize the variation in my data with respect to different human beings, and I want to maximize the variations in the data with respect to different classes. Right? So that is the basic, idea. So this is the general concept of all domain generalization in network. One such network is called a gradient reversal network. Right? Now here I have to go into a little technicality. See, when we train a network, right, what happens is that we compute a loss function, as we are discussing different types of loss functions since yesterday. Right? So we compute a loss function, and yesterday I had mentioned a term called back propagation, right? So we are basically doing some sort of a, gradient based optimization of the different weights of my filters, basically, right? So I have to optimize my filter weights, and I'm doing gradient based optimization. So now the, catch is that, normally I take the differentiation of the gradient, or sorry, differentiation of the loss function with respect to the parameter, where the loss is only the primary loss. In this case, the primary loss is, with respect to the object classes, right, which is the image classes, right? But now I can also define another type of loss, which I need to, the effect of which I need to maximize, right? So this other type of loss is the subject dependent loss, right? So now I have two losses. One is the class dependent loss, which is my primary objective, and one is the subject dependent loss, right, which is the secondary objective. Right? This is what I need to minimize, right? So I have to adjust the weight such that this loss is minimized, right? Which so I have to back propagate this derivative, in a normal way, what I usually do, such that these weights are minimized. But I have to back propagate this guy. See, if I also back propagate this guy in the same way that as this, right? Then I am actually losing the battle, right? Because now I am minimizing with respect to the subject variation also, and I am minimizing with respect to the class variations also, right? What I want is I want to adjust the parameter so that the minimization is happening with respect to the class variation, but I want to adjust the parameters such that the parameters will maximize the subject variation, right? So that means I don't have to propagate this loss, I don't have to back propagate the gradients with respect to, the class predictor. Sorry, I don't have to propagate the gradients with respect to the domain predictor, the same way as I'm propagating the gradient with the class predictor. What I have to do is the gradients with respect to the domain predictor, I have to propagate the negative of those gradients, right? So, because see, the role of the gradients is to, adjust the weight such that these losses are minimized. Right? So in any gradient based optimization, that is what is happening, right? So if I am adjusting the weight now in the opposite direction, right, of what it is supposed to do, then the weights will be maximized, or weights will be adjusted such that these losses become more and more, right? And this is exactly what I want, right? So this is basically the idea, that I want to minimize this loss and I want to maximize this loss, right? So the trick is that here you propagate the positive gradients and here you propagate the negative gradients with respect to this loss, right? So that is why it is called a gradient reversal layer, right? I am reversing my gradient such that the effect of this loss is maximized on these weights, right? So that is the idea, right? So normally the loss should be minimized, but this loss will be maximized with respect to these weights. So these weights will be adjusted so as to now reduce the variations in the data, or reduce the variations in the features across the subjects, and maintain the variation in the features as best as possible across the classes, right? So this is basically the idea of the gradient reversal, right? So that is the basic idea, right? So we saw three different types of classifiers, right? One is a simple classifier where the only major idea was that we are trying to play around with the dimensionality of the convolution based on the type of my signal. Then we've added further constraint in the loss, right, to improve the classification. And here we added, another constraint, not just to improve the classification as such, but also to reduce the effect of the subject variation. Right. This is an important point. Right? So yeah, so I'll skip this because this is another approach. Okay. So any questions till this point? So this is where this was about the classification. So we looked at three different architectures where we are trying to classify the EEG, and we progressively added more constraints in these classifiers, right? So as to address different types of issues that we may face, right? So one is a standard classifier, but better characterizing the nature of EEG. The second is, because EEG is noisy, we want to add more constraint. And the third is because EEG also has variations in the, in the data with respect to the subjects, we want to trying to minimize those, variations by adding a gradient reversal. Okay, so these are the three different, I mean, the idea again here is that, that I want to highlight that the same problem can be now looked at in progressively, sort of different ways, so as to get better and better results, right? So this area is still quite active. So if some of you are interested, you can also come up with different. Right. So now from the classification task, we move on to a reconstruction task. Okay? So this is quite interesting. So this is where you are looking at, the generative models. Right? Now, if you look at this, right, this looks like this looks very similar to the encoder decoder architecture that we saw yesterday. Right? So this is like a so that is the key in generative model, that the backbone of the generative model is very similar to the encoder decoder architecture. So whether you take a GAN model or whether you take a diffusion model, in all of these models the backbone is essentially a fancy version of a encoder decoder model. Okay? So which is what we had studied yesterday. Okay? So you can see, right, that this gets downsampled. You're talking of a compact representation, and then it is upsampled. Okay? Now, how does say a generative model work? Right. So this generative model is called a GAN, a generative adversarial network. Okay? So it will require a little bit of an explanation. Although some of you may know how a GAN works, but in the interest of everyone, I'll give a particular explanation. Okay, I'll give a small discussion. Okay? So right now, ignore this image classifier. Let's just focus on these two blocks. Right? This is what is called as a generator, and this is what is called as a discriminator. Right? Now, suppose forget about the EG also. Right? Suppose I give so in general, how a GAN works is as follows. Right? Suppose I have to generate realistic images from say a GAN model. Okay. Realistic images belonging to different types of objects, right? Say maybe a flower or a dog and so on, right? Or a mobile phone or a tree and such. Right? Now, what I do is I start with say some condition, or I can even start with noise. Okay? So condition is only when we want a specific type of image to be generated. Now, in this case, the condition is EEG, but you can also start with a text condition. That input can be a text, input can be a signal, whatever. Input can be another image also. Right? So, for example, if you want to generate a color image from a black and white image, you can give an input as an input. Right? But basically, we start with some condition. Okay? Now, initially, all these weights are random, as we know. Right? So, initially, this will generate some arbitrary thing. It will generate some random image. Right? It may not even look like an image. So it is clearly anyone can identify that this is a fake image, because it does not look anywhere close to a realistic image. It's just some random combination of pixels. Okay. Now what happens is there is a discriminator. Okay. Now discriminator's job is to classify between a real image and a fake image, because this is how it is trained. It's a binary classifier. So this one is a binary classifier. Don't bother about this right now. Just focus on this. Right? So the discriminator job is to only classify between a real and a fake image. Right? So if this guy is generating some junk, then discriminator job is very easy. Right? That it is already trained. Right? I mean, it is also being trained along with the generator. But if this is producing junk, right, which is clearly not a realistic image, then it can easily make a decision that this is a fake image. So this is how a discriminator would work. Right? Now, what a generator, the way these guys are trained is as follows. Right? So discriminator is trained so as to simply say whether the output of generator is real or fake. And the worse this quality is, the easier the task for the discriminator it is. That it can identify all such images as fake. Okay. Now, suppose this guy starts generating nicer and nicer images, right, more realistic images, then it will become harder for a discriminator to classify, right? So that is basically the idea, right? So in that sense, the generator and the discriminator is playing a game. Right? That the weights of the generator are trained such that it should generate better and better quality images depending on this condition. Okay, so if the condition is for a dog, then it should generate better and better quality dog images. If this condition is for a flower, it should generate better and better quality flower images. Right? If this condition is for a tree, then it should generate better quality tree images. Right? So there is a loss which is called a generator loss, and then there is a loss which is called a discriminator loss. Discriminator loss is simple, right? It's a simple classifier loss, right? Whatever comes out of this, it will do a binary classification, whether it thinks whether this is a image or fake image or a real image, right? So this is where, so the total loss is basically called as an adversarial loss, right? So what is happening here is that this is a classifier loss, okay? D of x is a classifier loss, okay? So x is the input, right? X is the input to the discriminator, right? So this is basically, this is what you are, so x is the input, x is the training input to the discriminator. So it is your training data. So you know that this is real images and these are fake images, right? So x is a set of real images. G of z is a set of generated images, okay? So the discriminator is supposed to, maximize the probability for the real images and minimize the probability for d of z. That's why this is 1 minus d of z, right? So if d of x is high, right, it is a good thing for the discriminator. If d of gz is low, then this will be high. So this is also a good thing for the discriminator. So the discriminator is supposed to maximize this term. That's why we have max of d. I hope this is clear. X is the real image. G of z is the generated image, right? Z is your condition, your input, right? So if d of x is high, right, then the discriminator is doing the right job because it should generate higher probabilities. D of gz is low, so 1 minus d of gz is high. So again, this term is high for a discriminator. So this whole thing is high for a discriminator. Right? For the generator, this term does not matter because it's not a function of g. This is what is matter. Now for the generator, see, this is the catch, that it should try to minimize this because it has to work in the opposite way of the discriminator, right? So if the generator produces good images, right, so that discriminator is high, see what does discriminator high mean, right? That it is giving higher probabilities to g of z, right? That means it is falsely detecting g of z as real images, right? And that is how a generator is supposed to work, right? So the generator will make this as high, that it should, the discriminator will make this as low, the generator will make this as high, right? So hence we are saying that the generator will minimize this term and the discriminator is supposed to maximize this term. Okay, this is why both of them work, in the opposite direction, right? So this is basically they are playing a game. The generator is trying to fool the discriminator into making wrong decisions by generating better and better images, right? So the stronger the discriminator, the harder the generator has to work to make, the discriminator make wrong decisions, and hence the harder the generator has to work, that means it has to produce even better and better images, right? So that the discriminator can be, fooled, right? So that's how these, things work. Right, so this is the basic idea. Now here, of course, just like we added more constraints, here we can add more constraints because we have say 40 classes, right? We have a large number of classes. We can add more constraints. For example, the classifier that we did earlier, we can add an image classifier that whatever is getting generated, whatever image is getting generated, if I'm also able to classify that correctly, then that means that the quality of the image generated is obviously better, right? So this acts as additional constraint to train the generator, that the generator should be trained not just to fool the discriminator, but also to make a classifier classify the images correctly. Right? This is a pre-trained image classifier. There are so many image classifiers out there, so and all of them are performing very well. Right? So we can take any pre-trained image classifier and basically compute this. Right? So the generator is now better constrained, not just in terms of fooling the discriminator. So this will only ensure that realistic images are getting generated, but this will also ensure that more relevant images are getting generated. Right? So because see, if my condition is dog and this produces a very good image of a flower, the discriminator will still say it is a real flower. So but that does not mean that the generator is doing it a nice job. Right? That's where the classifier comes in. That it's not just should be a realistic flower; it should actually be a realistic dog, right? Not a realistic flower. Right. So the role of discriminator and the image classifier is actually complementary. Okay? This is talking about the quality of the image generation, and this is talking about the relevance of the image generation. Okay, so this is where things are interesting. Right? So these are some of the results. Right now, like I said, EEG is inherently a noisy data, so you may not see very great results in this. So this was again about a work which was about 2 years old. Now we have improved these results. Right? With different models. But the important thing to note is that, see, if you look at each of this column, you can at least make out what the object is, which is itself a very sort of important sort of achievement, in the sense that my input is some random looking noisy signals, and from that I am able to generate this signals, right? This images, right? So clearly, when my input EEG is apple, it is at least generating something that looks like an apple. Right? When my input is EEG is corresponding to say a scooter, it is generating something which looks very similar to a scooter. Of course, the quality is very poor, right? But the relevance is very significantly good. Right, so this is the initial attempt, right, which in this area that we are able to reconstruct, the images only from the EEG signals. Right? That is a significant, idea. Right? Of course, then we kind of improved the work, a little more. So here the idea, we took a step back, right? So because we were getting this kind of result, we said that instead of generating images, can we generate some simple structures, right? And simple structures means that we are having, say depth maps, right? So see, so depth map is basically like, it is an image, but it does not have the colors of an image. It basically has the 3D shape of an image, right? So this is basically called a depth map, right? So obviously the amount of details of this is very, very, very low, right? So it's much simpler. It's a much simpler object to generate as compared to an image, which is more complicated because of so many variations, right? So because there are structure and color variations both. In the depth map, there are largely only structural variations and maybe some shading variations, which is much less as compared to what an image normally contains. Right? But here we are using a different framework. Okay? What we are essentially doing is, what we are saying is that, of course, this is done more recently. So nowadays we have better, networks called transformer networks and graph neural networks, right? Which can do a better job of, extracting features from, your data, right? So for example, a graph neural network is essentially, it's similar to a convolution network, but in a convolution network, we have, the data on a 1D or a 2D grid, right? So this is what a simple convolution network looks like, as we saw earlier. Right, so here we are getting the data on a 1D or a 2D grid. In a graph neural network, what happens is that we can get data in, sort of in more unstructured manner. Okay. So what it means is that suppose I have this nodes of EEG across the head. Right, suppose I have this node. Now the signal from each node or each channel, I can model this as a node in a graph, right? And I can make a graph, make a connected graph across all these channels. So basically, there will be a relationship between this signal and this, there will be a relationship between this and this, there will be a relationship between this and this, and so on, right? This, a convolutional network does not do in a very strong manner, right? What a convolution network would do is, if you look at this is a convolution across channel axis, right? But if you use say a very small filter, say a 3x3 or a 4x4 or a 5x5 filter, then it will only consider neighboring nodes, right? Whereas a graph neural network is essentially a network of nodes where these relationship between different nodes are better encoded. Right? So this is what is the strength of graph neural network, right? So each feature that is getting extracted is not just because of a local set of, signals, but it is based on, the relationship between the signal from one electrode to the rest of the electrodes. Right? So this is basically the idea of a graph neural network. So this is how we get a EEG embedding. So we learn a graph neural network to extract EEG features. We learn a simple CNN based model to learn, image features. And this is the important part, the contrastive, the triplet laws that we talked about earlier. This is similar laws where we are trying to bring these two features close together, right? Because the idea is that, I have some image features and I know ways to reconstruct the image features. Now, can I bring the EEG features in the space of the image features so that the decoder that has learned to reconstruct images, that decoder can now, during test time, what happens is this part vanishes. Right? During test time, I don't have the images. I only have EEG. Right? So I'm bringing my EEG features closer to the image features so that the decoder starts understanding the EEG, features, or starts interpreting the EEG features at least approximately as the image features. Right? So that is the idea, right? That the EEG features can start having some characteristics of the image features by, by minimizing the distance between the EEG encoding and the image encoding. So this is where, I mean, this is a different kind of a philosophy, right? Where we are trying to minimize or we are trying to establish a mapping between two different domains, by minimizing their, sort of distance between their encoding, right? So the decoder, which is similar to the encoder decoder that we, which is similar to the decoder in the architecture that we saw yesterday, the decoder has learned to reconstruct the depth map. Right? So it has originally learned to process images, right? Process the input image and reconstruct the depth map. Right? Now what I'm saying is that if I'm able to map the EEGs onto the depth map space, right, then I am able to, the decoder is kind of interpreting EEG such that it has certain features of the depth maps, and hence it is able to, decode the depth map only from the EEG without the help of the image. That is the idea. So because during test time I will only have this part, right? I'll only have this part. I will not have this part, right? Obviously, right? Because test time I only have EEG. So these are some of the results, right? So this is the original depth map. This is the depth map, as I said, which the decoder has learned directly to reconstruct from the image, right? So this and this are very close together, right? This and this are very close to each other because obviously such decoders work very well, right? So this is a simple. This is that example of yesterday, like I said, right? That if I give a image at the input and the depth at the output, the idea is that the encoder decoder has to convert an image to the depth. Right, that is basically the idea. Right, I now have an EEG corresponding to that image. So if I am able to map the EEG features to the image feature space, right, then I am the decoder will start interpreting the EEG features as the image features. So you can see that the depth is obviously not as accurate as this, but it is this is only with EEG, only reconstructed with EEG. Right? So it is at least capturing the structure of the signal of the image, basically, based on only EEG, and the decoder which is now taking the transformed EEG features based on this learning. Right? So that is so this EEG encoder is trained so as to minimize the contrastive loss between this and this. Now this was also pretty interesting because again we are able to learn a rough structure only with EEG data. Right? This is basically what we want. Right? Now how are we using this? I think we are kind of running out of time a little bit, but let me just quickly now this is a more recent work. This we are publishing it soon. Right? So here we are using a better model, better generative model, not the GAN model. We are using a diffusion model, which is, which I mean, I may not have time to go into more detail, but let's just assume that it's a better generative model. But again, the important concept is that we are not training, this, okay. What we are doing is that we are taking this EEG encodings using, so this is the example of a graph that I mentioned, that each node is a signal from each electrode, right, as an input layer. And of course, so this graph is actually learning, relationship between signals rather than relation between signals at higher non-local features, rather than the convolution networks which are learning relationships at a very local region. So, but anyway, so this is basically, this is what we just discussed, here, right? So we are getting a depth map here. Now what we are doing is, you take any generative model, right? It could be a GAN, it could be a diffusion, and so on, right? This is just a diffusion model, so it is able to generate better images. But our goal is not just to generate better images. Our goal is, now see, I mentioned earlier that if I am seeing a particular tiger in the previous framework, that tiger or that scooter or that dog may not be generated. I may generate a tiger image, right? Now what my goal is, that whatever I'm seeing, I should generate something which is close to that. So at least the structure should be roughly preserved, right, close to what I'm basically seeing, right? So if I'm seeing a tiger which is standing, right, I should be able to generate a tiger which is standing, right, in my output. If I'm generate a house, a tree of a particular type, I should again generate a tree of that type. I should not generate some arbitrary tree, which was what was basically not happening in the previous, work. Okay? So what we are doing is, because now we are able to have a reasonably good structural, reconstruction here in depth, we are using that structural reconstruction as a constraint in the generative network, right? So as such, I have a generative network which can generate conditional images. So I can still get images of the same class, but the images may not have the same structure, right? For example, if I get it for a tree class, if I don't have any constraint, I will get some arbitrary tree classes. I mean, I'll get some arbitrary trees, right? I may not get, see, if an image is of a pine tree, but my tree data set has a large variety of trees, right? Then I may get a mango tree, or I may get other plant, and so on. Right? That is not what I want here. I want to further constrain the problem that if I am able to see a dog in this pose, for example, I should also be able to generate a dog in this pose, right? This is where I am constraining this with whatever I am learned here. Okay, so this is the idea of this kind of a model, right? That you have a generative model, right, which can be a GAN or which can be a diffusion model and so on, right? But we are constraining that generative model further with the structure, so that it will generate more relevant images, not just in terms of classes, but also in terms of structure, right? So these are some of the examples that we now see, right? That if I give this EEG corresponding to this piano, now you can see in the previous example we were seeing arbitrary generations. In this case, we are at least approximately seeing the piano in the same orientation, right? Similarly, if I give this plane, at least I'm able to see plane in similar orientation, and so on, right? I'm able to see, because now I have a structure that is constraining what kind of images should be generated, right? So among this large set of among this large set of distribution that I can sample from, this is now constraining a space of the distribution, that okay, now we want to sample images which has the shape which look like this, right? So of course, see, there are some errors, right? For example, this is an error example, right? but again, these are much reduced as compared to the previous cases, right? So this is the basic idea, right? So we moved from a noisy generation to a structure generation, but for a simpler sort of 2D representation, in this case a depth map, to a much better generation. The quality is also good, which is of course thanks to the better generative model. We are not using GAN here, we are using diffusion model. But just using diffusion model does not guarantee that only similar structured images will be produced, right? That guarantee, or that at least behavior, is possible because of using depth as a constraint when we are generating these images. So this is also something interesting that is happening, right? Okay, so any questions till this point? Okay, so we are almost at the end. So basically so that was basically the idea of the perceptual brain decoding, which was basically divided into two problems. One is the classification task, as we saw here, and one is a decoding task. Okay, one is a reconstruction task, right? Now, of course, we've been working on other more clinical related applications of EEG also, which basically deal with simple applications of convolution network with some, with some different, say, attention mechanisms and so on, right? But the idea here is, again, the point that I want to stress here is that in the previous cases, we were focusing on time domain representation of EEG. Now here we are focusing on frequency domain representation of EEG. Why is that? Because here, for example, we are looking at artifact classification, right? Now EEG can, when you're recording EEG, like I said, right, different people can react in different ways when the EEG is recorded, right? So we can have say somebody, the very common artifact is a eye blinking, right? Similarly, somebody can move their hands, move their fingers, and so on. That is basically called as a muscle artifact, right? So see, how do we define an artifact? The artifact is any variation in the signal which is not related to the task at hand, right? So then somebody may move their jaw, for example, that we call as a chewing artifact, right? And so on, right? So basically there are different types of artifacts. So in many data sets there are different data sets for different artifacts, right? But in the time domain where we see those noisy signals, it is not easy to differentiate between these artifacts, right? So I think many of you would know what Fourier transform is, right? Fourier transform is when we go from the time domain representation to a frequency domain representation. Okay? So here what we are doing is that what we realize is that the artifacts are far more differentiable in the frequency domain than in the time domain, right? So for example, these are frequency domain plots. As you can see the bright regions means that the frequency content in those parts is more. The dark regions mean that the frequency content in those parts is less, right? So this is the channel axis, this is the frequency axis. Just a minute, I'll just take a 2-minute break.
Thank you so much, sir.
No, I am just taking a phone call. I'll just be back in a bit. Okay.
Okay, okay, sir.
Okay, I'm back. Okay, so yeah, so basically what we are focusing here on is the idea that if we go from the time domain to frequency domain, we can sometimes see better differentiation between the classes that we are interested in, right? So in this case, in the time domain, the data is too noisy, but in the frequency domain, we can see clear differentiation between the different types of artifacts, right? Now, why is artifact classification important? Because see, there are methods for removing artifacts, right? But if I want to apply a particular method, I should know what kind of artifact is there in my signal, right? And when I'm processing the signal in the offline manner, I have no track of the fact what the person was doing when the signal was getting recorded, right? So first I need an artifact classification step, and once I know that that a signal has these kinds of artifacts, then I apply appropriate approaches to remove those kinds of artifacts. For example, an eye blink artifact will have a very different characteristics as a muscle artifact, so I cannot apply the same technique to remove the eye blink artifact, as the techniques to remove the muscle artifact. Right? So this is the motivation of why this kind of a problem is important. Right? Similarly, we are looking at another area where again frequency domain classification or frequency domain representation is important. This is the area of epileptic seizure type classification, right? So whenever a person has a type of seizure, right, again the medication of the seizure depends on the type of seizure, or even the diagnosis of the seizure depends on the type of seizure. Like for example, some seizures are originating from a particular part of the brain, which are called focal seizure. Some seizures are originating for multiple parts of the brain. These are called grand mal seizures and so on. So there are like this. There are like 5 or 6 primary categories of seizures. And again, from a clinical perspective, it is important to understand which type of seizure is actually happening. Right? So this is where this kind of work is also useful. Again, the same philosophy that in the time domain, it is difficult to understand the differences between the seizure characteristics. So we again go in the frequency domain, and in the frequency domain, it becomes much easier to understand seizure characteristics. So I'll not go into too much into details. The attention layer we discussed yesterday, it has a similar function here. That whenever we extract features from, so this is a standard CNN network, right? But it has an attention block. What an attention block is doing is, for example, this ResNet block is expanded here. Each of that ResNet block has an attention block. An attention block is essentially doing is that when we are extracting different attributes from the CNN filters, the attention block is learning which of those attributes are important for the finding classification. So that is basically the idea of attention block. So these days, almost all CNN architecture will use an attention block, because it's not just enough to learn the attributes, but it is also now, at least in the contemporary methods, it is also important to understand that for my particular classification task, which of those attributes are important, and can I automatically weigh the selection of those attributes. Right? So that is basically the idea of attention block. Right? So this is the architecture that we are using. Right? Okay, and finally, another work that we are doing here, is again an application of EEG for another cognitive task, which is mental workload classification, which is again particularly useful in many sort of say tasks which involve sort of very critical mental faculties, right? So for example, if my job involves monitoring some critical behavior for hours and hours together, say monitoring something in the industry, right? Or say an air traffic control, right? Say if I'm a doctor and I'm continuously seeing patients and so on, right? So obviously after some time there's something called as mental workload, that when I start doing, I mean, this we all probably experience in some way or the other. When we start doing a particular task, the task is easy, but as we spend minutes, hours and so on, as we spend more and more time, we start getting exhausted, right? So this is basically cognitive. This is essentially called cognitive load, right? Similarly, if I have to do multiple tasks together, right, that also constitutes in mental workload, right? So in many critical jobs, right, mental workload is a very critical problem, and one needs an objective method. So of course there are behavioral approaches that you can always observe a person and see how he's behaving and so on, right? But a more objective way is to record EEG, basically, right? If a person is given a particular task for a lengthy period of time, how is the EEG changing across time, right? So there are different classes of mental workload. So you can see that this is where the mental workload is relatively small. This is where the mental workload is higher, and this is where the mental workload is very high, right? So there are some standard cognitive tasks which involve multitasking decisions, or which involve like intense attention tasks and so on. So there are some, for example, one such task is called as an n-back task, right? Which is basically you are supposed to remember some numbers on the screen, and if the number is repeated after some time, you should flag that number, something like that. So which involves constant attention for very long periods of time, right? And during that period, we record mental workload. We record EEG corresponding to the mental workload, different states of mental workload, right? And then we try to classify it, right? So this is another useful application. So all of these three are kind of clinical or preclinical applications when it comes to EEG. And the first thing that we did in more detail was sort of an interesting perceptual decoding application, which is of course a very new area in EEG. But again, the goal of this work was to introduce you to different applications of EEG, as well as to introduce you to the different flavors of networks and different constraints and different loss functions that we use in a very thoughtful manner. So again, we are not building these architectures in an arbitrary manner. There is a thought process which goes on, as we saw in the earlier part. For example, improving the classification, then reducing the subject variances, then improving the mapping between the EEG and the image representations and so on. So there is a there is always a salient thought process behind the kind of approaches that we develop, and these thought process they result into these kinds of designing of deep neural networks, which then target different kinds of applications for EEG. Right? So this is where I stop, and if you have any questions, feel free.
Thank you so much, sir.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much for such informative session. On the behalf of the organizers and participants, I sincerely thank you for your insightful talk on AI application in health and biosignal analysis. The session was very clear and engaging, beginning with EEG and its applications such as brain-computer interfaces for controlling devices like wheelchairs, and further covering perceptual brain decoding with its underlying framework. Your explanation of these complex concepts was presented with great clarity, making the ideas very impactful. We deeply appreciate the time and efforts you devoted to sharing your expertise, which has great enriched this faculty development program. Thank you so much, sir.
Thank you very much. So thanks for the
If
opportunity.
anyone has query, you may
Yeah.
kindly ask.
Yeah, if anyone wants to contact me later on, you can share my contact details with the audience. Right? So,
Okay, thank you,
thank
sir,
you.
for your insightful and interesting presentation and for patiently addressing the topic. I'm sure all the participants have greatly benefited from your lecture. I also thank all the participants for their active involvement. With this, we conclude session 11 of our FDP, and I request you all to kindly join the 12th session at the earliest. Thank you so much.
I think there is a raised hand. In case anyone has a query, I can check. I think somebody had just raised a hand. I'm not sure. Okay. Anyways, so thank you very much for the opportunity. And if you have any queries or any further
Sir, sir,
scope of yes, please
sir,
go
good
ahead.
afternoon, sir.
Yes, yes.
So one small. So in the initial slides, you mentioned about epilepsy, right?
Yes.
This particular models is using for epilepsy
Yeah.
detection also.
Yes.
Like, is there any research is going on? Like, by seeing the child's vision, they can able to detect that epilepsy by capturing the EEGs. Any research?
So see, epilepsy. Normally in epilepsy, uh, the EEG is not. I mean, see, during the seizure, it's not important to take an epilepsy because during the seizure, anyways, the person is, you can see the behavior, what the person is. I mean, whether it
Yeah,
is
yeah.
happening.
Even the brain itself in the sleeping mode, sir.
Yes,
Definitely,
right.
that
So
EEG
there
can.
are two aspects that. So sometimes, when we want to classify between type of epilepsy, because that is important for treatment, they will try to induce seizures in a controlled manner, okay, and then record EEG, right? But the other way is that, you know, so suppose a person is wearing the EEG for long periods of time, right? And these are again lightweight EEGs and so on. Right? Say a
Yes,
patient
yes.
who is in the hospital for treatment, he's generally wearing the cap, right? And before the seizure occurs, there are some EEG signatures which basically signify that a seizure is going to happen in the next half an hour or next 15 minutes and so on. Now that is important because that is more like a predictive signature, right?
Yeah.
So in epilepsy there are two kinds of researches that are happening. One is to classify the epilepsy, which is basically when the seizure is happening. Right? So this is happening, when the seizure is induced, right? Because they want to understand what kind of epilepsy is, right? But the other is that during say the treatment phase or a rehabilitation phase and so on, the person is sort of, or when the person they're planning the medication and so on. Uh, it's a it, you know These are more predictive algorithms that before the seizure actually happens, the EEG can detect whether the AI systems can detect that the seizure is happening in the next few minutes. Now there the challenge is how early can I detect. Okay, so there
Yes,
are
yes.
works which are, I mean, this duration is progressively improving. At earlier works used to detect, say, 10 minutes ago. Now there are works which are able to detect 30 minutes ago and so on. So the idea is that 30 minutes ago the signature will be very minute, right? But still, can I have method which can detect epilepsy, right? So these are the two directions in epileptic research that is happening with respect to AI.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you, sir.
Yeah, okay.